away from debate toward collaboration will be advantageous, if not essential, for your success. And he says that if we use collaboration as a default, we would build better solutions to solutions and stronger relationships among participants, preventing conflict before it begins in our workplaces, our communities, our careers, among friends, family. And you all will gain an introduction to an easy to learn, easy to use collaborative model with a focus on 2 keys to collaboration that anyone can use each day. So it's going to be a very practical talk. We also got very interesting topics when you registered. I got some of them, like conflict resolution through unconventional methods, how to improve collaboration with teams, how to prevent conflict with people who are not like-minded, how to convince them, and how to convince team members that the development or training sessions organized are for their growth. And sometimes lack of clarity on these things lead to unnecessary conflicts, discussions, arguments. We're also going to be talking about stress management, which is a very important issue. And also, I also separated one more, which I found very interesting, which is conflict resolution, negotiation, strategies after the pandemic, where we know we are all very fragile, and we have more and more chances of having conflicts in our professional lives. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Patrick Aylward. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Today, so far, we have 51 participants. So thank you all for being with us. Feel free to ask questions on the chat, because at the end of the talk, we're going to have a Q&A session, so we can try to cover as many topics as you wish. Patrick, thank you very much. And these guys are all yours. Thank you very much once again. And please let us know what the collaborative path is all about. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. And welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled that so many of you showed up for my presentation. By way of introduction, thank you again for that introduction. I often refer to myself as a recovering lawyer, and some would say a misguided mediator. Now, the misguided piece you will get to in a second to see what I mean by that, because I challenge some of the very basic truisms in the field of conflict resolution in my book and in this presentation. And yes, my mission is to create a global culture of collaboration. And in order to do that, the idea is to replace the debate style approach to human interaction with my collaborative model as the default. Today, we use the debate approach as the default. So what makes for a debate, and how does it show up? Where does it show up? Well, for a debate, you need first some context or situation or problem. Then the second thing you need is you need 2 sides. Third, you need presentation and rebuttal about the pros and the cons. So it's back and forth. And the last thing you need is you need a resolution. So you need a closing with a decision where all the resources go to A or all the resources go to B. That makes for a debate. Now, what does a debate require? It requires that early narrowing of a situation to 2 sides, the definition of an either or choice to be made. Around that, one of the expressions I often use is that when we narrow our options early, we narrow our minds forever. That becomes relevant when I start to talk about debate causing us to miss opportunities. The second thing a debate requires is the ability, and I suppose it's really more a mindset, to present defend, and rebut. And if you're going to do that and do it well, then you need a judgmental spirit that your side is right. Because the last thing you ever want to do in debate is to entertain the idea that the other side makes sense. So you can't listen to learn. You have to learn. You have to listen to respond. It's the only effective way to listen in a debate. Where does it show up? It shows up in analysis, in papers, in briefing notes, and that kinds of things, business papers, proposals. Look at the papers you've done so far in your education and your career. And tell me if this pattern of analysis looks familiar. 4 steps. Describe the situation. Create an issue statement, identifying the choice, usually 2 options. Sometimes there's a third. It's usually a throwaway. A discussion of the pros and cons, and then a conclusion, reaching the decision or the recommendation that you want to make. That's the format that we use for analysis to support decision making, isn't it? And brevity, clarity, and logic leading to a decision are the hallmarks of a solid analysis. Now think back to your last analysis, last one you did or reviewed. Kind of sort of knew where you wanted it to land before you began writing. And you might have tilted the issue statement to favor that outcome that you were heading toward. You might also have presented the favor side a bit more persuasively than the other option. Now, I'm not suggesting that doing any of those things and all of those things is to have done anything wrong. It's normal. That is the pattern that we use. And I've done it myself a gazillion times as a policy analyst, as a lawyer, and so on. I wanted you to recall your last one because I want to invite you to step back from it for a moment and consider, was it decision-making analysis or was it decision-taken analysis? Big difference. When we create decision-taken analysis, what we're doing is we're using a debate approach to rationalize the decision for which the paper was written. And we do it without the other side present. Debate also shows up in workplace conversations. And in your career, this is the one that will impact you the most. Let's talk about a little 3-letter word for a minute, but. Now, we can use a variety of formats for it. We can use 1 syllable, but. We can use the back room or the backyard but, what kids would call yeah but. And we can use the more sophisticated boardroom but, called however. So we use 3 syllables in the boardroom, 2 in the backyard, and 1 if we want to be really short about it. Whatever version you use, though, it has the same effect. It erases everything you said before the word but. Example, I like what you're saying. However, I hear your point, but. So remember, please, 2 things. There's no such thing as a good but. And 2, but is a classic sign of a debate, signaling the start of someone's rebuttal. It's a classic signal of the pattern of listening to respond. If we're listening to respond, what we're really doing is waiting for that opportunity to jump in and go, yeah, but that isn't what you said earlier. Yeah, but, however, and so on. And that's what we do in a debate is we jump in to rebut. We'll often go, hey, I know what you were going to say, but anytime we're hearing but in that early part of a conversation, we're listening to a debate approach conversation. Sound familiar? Bet you hear it a lot, and you'll notice it a lot more when you return to the workplace on Monday. Again, it's normal. It is our default, and I'm not judging anyone for using it. Done it myself a lot of times. Here's a couple of fun facts for you. We can speak at about 150 words a minute. Now, if someone is speaking to me in my second language, French, it feels like they're talking to me at 300 words a minute, and it's still only 150. We can absorb, though, about 450 words per minute. What do you think we do with that excess capacity? Great stuff to start our response with, isn't it? We are biologically capable of preparing our response while we're taking in what the other person said. And so we often just shortcut it and start into our response early because we are listening to listening to respond. I come from a big family, 11. So 7 boys, 4 girls. At a family reunion, wow, there's a lot of conversations going on. Now, I can walk in the front door and I catch 2 brothers talking about a car, and am I muted? No, okay. I hear 2 more talking about, 2 more talking about music, and a couple more talking about something going on in religion. So I can walk in and I ask the first 2, have you thought about this, about that engine? I ask the next ones, hey, yeah, I really like that song. And have you heard Brad Paisley's latest? And then I talk to my sisters or throw in a question into the third conversation. That's a simple example of that whole idea that, yeah, we can actually hear or process a lot more words than one individual can speak to us at a time. And I'm sure you've experienced the same thing if you think about it around social gatherings that you've been in. Now, where does that really show up, the debate, though, in the workplace conversations? I talk in my book about 3 in particular, what I call the big 3 conversations in the workplace that are sucking the life out of almost every workplace every day. The bottle, the blurt, and the blab. The bottle conversation. The bottle is the one where Paul is upset with Kate about something that she did or didn't do, something that isn't working for him. And for any number of reasons, Paul chooses not to address it with her. He makes excuses for her. Oh, maybe Kate's just having a bad day. Or he makes excuses for himself. Maybe I didn't handle that as well. So if I do things differently, it will be different. And sometimes he just says, well, that's just Kate. I suppose I can't change her. I might make matters worse, so I'll just leave it alone. Whatever one he uses, or any combination of them, the only conversation that Paul is having with Kate is the one bottled up in his head. The second conversation is the blurt. Now the pressure starts to build in that bottle, and sooner or later, Kate does something that's pretty innocuous. Normally, people wouldn't get upset about it. But Paul, he explodes and blurts out something that is mean-spirited, condescending, or sarcastic. That conversation never ends well. If Paul doesn't blurt, he'll use the third option. He'll have the third conversation, the blab, with his colleague, Mary. So he'll go down and he'll talk to Mary, and he's got a variety of options again, right? He can say, I like Kate, but have you ever noticed that she's like this? Or, oh my God, You wouldn't believe what Kate just did again. And he's tearing the hair out of his head. So regardless again of which one he uses, his blurt conveys a couple of extra messages for which he never uses words. And here's where the damage is. If Kate is like this with me, you better watch out, because she'll be like that with you. And the second one, if I'm upset with Kate, you should be upset too. The blab is the most insidious of the big three. Can you still hear me, Daniel?
Yeah, perfectly well. Perfectly
okay,
well.
Perfect. Thank you. I got a little beep in my phone or my earpiece, and I wasn't quite sure. It's the most insidious because in the bottle, Paul harms himself. He doesn't get what he wants met at all. In the blab, he harms both he and Kate. And in the blab, he harms the whole workplace because he starts building camps with those two messages for which he didn't use any words. Now, I'd say they come out of a debate or format. Why do I say that? Well, look at the judgmental nature of it. The problem is Kate. In the blab, the problem is Paul. Or sorry, in the blurt. In either it's I'm right, he's wrong, or she's wrong. The other part of the judgmental spirit is this. That idea that what the other person is doing doesn't make any sense. So what Kate is doing doesn't make any sense to Paul, and what Paul did makes no sense to Kate. I use an expression often when I'm coaching. I tell people that even the criminally insane have a reason for what they do. It makes sense to them. And if we were ever going to influence them, it would probably be important to understand why it makes sense to them. In a debate, you have to believe that what the other side is saying is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together. We just translated that into the ordinary daily conversation. How important are these conversations in the workplace? The cost, a congruence of studies, one across 9 industrialized nations, provides empirical evidence of a wastage, 2.5 hours per employee per week wasted unproductively because of conflict in the workplace. So if you take that and use the average hourly rate in your workplace, you kind of have a good idea of just how costly that debate approach is and those 3 conversations. Let's come back to what does our use of the debate approach require of us? I've mentioned a couple of times it requires a judgmental spirit. It requires us to listen to respond, to train ourselves to do that. It requires an instant evaluation of every idea that the other person raises, because you need to rebut. And it requires faith. Faith that one of the 2 sides is the optimal decision. And faith that debate is the optimal approach to make a decision. So let's look at that faith. How well placed is that faith? Lots of examples exist where an either-or approach produced very poor outcomes, and no one ever looked for other solutions, because in a debate, either one has to be right. So opportunities are missed. And I'm sure we can each recall a situation where the debate approach and its winner-loser outcome damaged relationships, if not destroyed them. So yeah, a debate is pretty much the approach we use as the default to human interaction in daily life, in community groups, in our homes, and yeah, in our workplaces. Had it ever occurred to you that the debate approach, what I've labeled as adjudicative in my book, pervades human interaction to the extent that I've described? And you know what's really awful? We use it so naturally, so frequently, that it's invisible to us. We've been doing it since the days of Socrates. And its limitations. An either-or approach in today's complex world? How many situations can you think of that really come down or can be distilled down into either or? Not a hell of a lot. It's a primary trigger for conflict because it sets up all or nothing, win and lose, and not hearing each other. And disengagement in the workplace. Those three conversations, the big three. Disengagement in the community group. Volunteers who leave not because they didn't have something to contribute. They left because they weren't being heard and the format didn't permit them to make the contribution that they joined to make. And the church hall committee. No one is immune from the effects of the debate approach. How about the relationship between difference and debate? Some might say, well, hey, Edward, doesn't conflict come from differences? No, opportunity does. Here's what I mean by that. Noticing differences is essential for every human advancement because anything acceptable to all has no need for improvement. Example, if everyone were okay with getting water from streams, we would have no need for wells. If everyone were okay with foraging the bounty of nature, whatever it happened to produce, we would have no need for agriculture. If everyone were content in a cave, we would have no need for housing and shelter. Everything depends upon noticing or discovery of differences and dissatisfaction with the status quo. I'll touch upon diversity here because that was one of the questions or topics raised. That's why diversity is so important. Even if I only wanted improvement and advancements for people who are just like me, diversity would be important to me. Because if everyone is just like me, then there's a really good chance that everything that is acceptable to me is acceptable to them. And if something is acceptable to everyone, there's no need for improvement. So diversity is an absolute key. It's the secret sauce to human advancement. Conflict, coming back to that first question, conflict is triggered by the judgmental spirit that's essential to the debate approach that we bring to the conversation about differences. It's not the differences themselves that trigger conflict. So let's say you buy into the presentation so far and you say, okay, fair enough, Aylward. Debate might have its limitations and yeah, it's damaged a few relationships. What's your alternative? My alternative is the collaborative model. I define collaboration as the deliberate pursuit of dual outcomes, better solutions to situations and stronger relationships among participants. How often do we get the impression that people are thinking, you know, I can be nice or I can be effective. I can deliver results or I can develop relationships, and I can't do both. You can do both.
Patrick,
yes.
I'm sorry. I love the definition of collaboration. Could you come up with it again?
Sure. Collaboration is the deliberate pursuit of dual outcomes, better solutions to situations and stronger relationships to participants.
Awesome.
We don't have to live in an either or where we choose. We can have both.
Perfect. Thank you.
My pleasure. And at its simplest, conflict is problem plus tension. If you think about it, if Danielle, if you and I were working on something and you see it one way and I see it the other, and we're just going back and forth on how we're going to address the situation, that's not a conflict. It only becomes a conflict when either of us or both of us starts to see how the other person is approaching it as part of the problem, and some level of tension starts to rise. So if collaboration is better solutions and stronger relationships, and conflict is problem plus tension, then these two have an inverse relationship, correlation. They are inversely proportional. The more collaboration you have, the less conflict you have. So how do we do this collaboration stuff that Aylward's talking about? 6 steps, easy to learn, easy to use. What makes it easy to learn and easy to use is that for each step, there's only one objective, and you can conceptualize it as a single key question. So let's start with the objectives for each step and the 6 steps. The first step is to set parameters for the conversation. In doing so, what we're doing is creating an atmosphere of safety for a productive conversation. Step 2 is to exchange perspectives in that climate of safety. What we're doing there is to give each the opportunity to hear and to be heard. So that's the listening to learn stage. Step 3, we're going to describe the issue. And what we're going to do in how we do it is we're going to open the conversation so that both parties or all participants can talk about what's important to them and their experience. So we're going to use broad, neutral language to describe the issue. Step 4, we're going to identify interests. Effectively, we're going to figure out what we want and what we want to avoid when we address the situation. The objective of doing that is to increase mutual understanding. And I'll talk in a bit about how and why that happens. Step 5, we generate options. And what we're doing is creating new ideas to meet the wants that we identified in step 4 to address the issue that we described in step 3. So you can see the logic in it. In step 6, we're going to select and evaluate the solutions or the options. And so what we're doing is we're going to select the ideas that advance the wants that we described in step 4 so as to address the issue described in step 3. So that is the 6 steps and the objective of each, only one objective for each step, and a bit of the logic of why the model works. Two things to note. Note how late in the collaborative model options are developed compared to the debate. And note, secondly, how informed those options would be by the stakeholder or participant interests compared to in a debate. So how do we do this? What's that key question for each step? The key question for each step is this. In set parameters, we're going to ask the question, how are we going to talk about what we're going to talk about before we get into the conversation? So what do we need in order to have a safe and effective, productive conversation? Step 2, the question is, how do we each see the situation and how are we experiencing it? Notice how when you answer that question, you don't end up in a rebuttal, because whoever speaks first is irrelevant in terms of what the second person says, because they each prepare how they see the situation and how they're experiencing it is independent of each other. So you get into the debate. When we're describing the issue, the key question is, how can we describe the issue so that we can both talk about what's important to us and both contribute to a solution? Step 4, identify what we want, our interests. And in that, the key question is, what do we each want and want to avoid in a solution? In step 5, generating options, what we're asking really is, what can we do now, next, or differently that will satisfy our wants that we just described? And step 6, which options or package of options get us most of what we want? So 6 steps, 1 objective at each step, and 1 key question at each step. Where can it be used? Well, it can be used for analysis. Papers can be constructed using that exact same 6-step process. Analysis using the model would search for a solution rather than presenting reasoning to justify a decision already taken. The options would be informed by the stakeholder interests. And the discussion would be a comparison of how the options available respectively aligned with the stakeholder interests that were identified. It could be used in conversations, into everyday conversation to replace the bottle, the blurt, and the blab. In my book, I talk about 3 skills to address each of those conversations and to transform them to a collaborative conversation. So the first one is a C message or collaborative message to address the bottle. So that enables Paul to have that conversation at the moment that he notices that what Kate is doing isn't working so well for him. De-escalation and reorientation is a skill that Kate can use when Paul blurts at her to de-escalate the anxiety and stress that Paul is feeling, and to reorient the conversation into a collaborative one that gets the conversation back on track to figure out what is it that we want, what do we want to avoid, and what could we do now, next, or differently to get there. And the third is a sounding board skill, which Mary would use with Paul to help Paul figure out how he's going to address the issue with Kate rather than blabbing. It can be used for problem solving. Meetings, as MBA students, candidates, and successful graduates, as business people, as entrepreneurs, you're going to have a lot of meetings. So much better to have them using this collaborative model to change the conversation in the boardroom. Community groups, building a consensus about the solution to a situation to replace the debate and vote that is commonly used in small communities and committees. The collaborative model is easy to learn, easy to use, and easy to teach. And there are really 2 keys to it. If there were only 2 things that you did differently, two things that you would need to do in order to be collaborative and to change the conversations. The first would be to adopt a spirit of curiosity instead of a judgmental spirit. There can be very little learning in the absence of curiosity, and it really is the great divide between a judgmental spirit and one of curiosity. The brain, I am told, can vacillate between those, and it cannot pursue both at the same time, judgmental and curious. It's the same neurological principle as the idea that Dr. Susan David talks about with embracing courage and comfort. She says we can do one or the other, and we can't do both at the same time. Our brains are incapable of it. The second thing, if you just set the parameters for the conversations before you had them, if you set the parameters for the boardroom discussion before you had it, it would significantly change things. Why this one? Let me talk a bit about where this came from, the evidence behind it. So this arose out of the research of Dr. John Gottman in the Gottman Institute in New York. So he was a psychologist studying the relationship of marriage, and he over decades. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to find out what's the secret of solid marriages and so on. So he set up what they called the Love Lab. The media dubbed it the Love Lab. And it was like a kitchenette and a small sofa and then one-way glass with a team of psychologists behind it, videotaping and observing the couples. So they would come in and they talked about everything. They talked about the in-laws and the outlaws. They talked about, finance and debt. They talked about infidelity. They talked about everything. There was nothing that was off the table. And when they had those conversations, they come in, he had them metered. He knew their pulse rates and their breathing rates and their body temperatures and their blood pressure. So he had a ton of data from them. And as they were watching them, they noticed a pattern. Which conversations were ending well? The ones that started well. Regardless of the topic, they were able to predict whether a couple would have a successful conversation or not based upon what happened in the first 3 minutes. 3 minutes, regardless of the topic. How accurate? More than 95% of the time they could do this. Why? The ones that started well took the time to talk about how they were going to talk about what they were going to talk about, recognizing that the subject matter was going to be a bit of a challenge for them. So step one isn't just out of my head somewhere, very solid evidentiary base for it. If I were going to throw in a third key, it would be that delay of option creation and not doing it until you completed that step 4, the identification of what is it that we want and what do we want to avoid. Someone had asked, how does this work? How we are wired as humans across gender and generation, across creed, color, and culture is such that when we explore what we want and want to avoid about a situation, we generate lists that are compatible, very compatible on several points. And as that compatibility emerges, we increase in mutual understanding. We start to see that there's more that unites than divides. That whole growth in mutual understanding, and that really is the focus of collaboration. It's not about building trust per se, it's about increasing mutual understanding. The increase in mutual understanding starts with the setting of parameters. There's some commonality in that. It continues when we listen to learn in the exchange of perspectives. And it fully blossoms in step 4 when we see the compatibility between what we want and want to avoid. I want to leave some time for questions. So in wrapping up, I received your topics and I noticed that they focused heavily on conflict. And you might be thinking, hey, you're near the end of the talk. When are you going to talk a lot about conflict? I'm not. My talk is really about collaboration. And if your interactions incorporate my collaborative model, you won't have to talk a lot about conflict much either. Conflict and collaboration are inversely proportional. By being collaborative, you prevent conflict before it ever begins by changing the conversation. You have to do it? No, you don't have to do it. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. Lots of conflict and missed opportunities. Because the surest way from the discovery of differences to optimal outcomes is the collaborative path. So final couple of comments. For anyone who missed the live version and isn't here for the question session to follow, please contact me on LinkedIn with any questions you have, or you can reach me at patrick@collaborativepath.ca. It's been a pleasure to participate in your learning and growth journey, and may it continue throughout your life. With that, Danielle, I'm happy to field questions from the participants. Thank you, everyone.
That's great, Patrick. Well, it was a wonderful talk. We have some interesting questions and remarks here. We have a participant with his virtual hand raised, and we're going to be calling Shrey in a minute. But we first have a question by Daniel. And before I ask his question, I can say that I really loved what you said, that collaboration and conflict are inversely proportional. That's really, really interesting. And definitely what you said, collaboration is the deliberate pursuit for dual outcomes. That was really interesting and amazing. So Daniel, he has a question. Daniel, would you like to address the question? You can just unmute your mic. I have it on chat here, but you can just unmute and do it, right?
Sure. Thank you, Daniel, for letting me ask my question virtually. Patrick, yes, I'm a different Daniel, just to clear your confusion, in case you're wondering. So my question here is, so you talked a lot about how but is often the cause for polarity between you and the other person, yeah? So does this mean that the use of but should be intended for debate purposes exclusively? Or do you think but can be used outside of debate context? Please take it away.
Thank you. Good question. Two parts to that. In conversations, if you want to have a more effective collaborative type conversation, Daniel, then substituting the word and for but is grammatically correct and far more effective. It joins the other person's perspective with yours, whereas but erases what the other person had said or what you said about them. So that's the first part. Now, it's nice to think that we can use and instead of but all of the time. If we're watching, a soccer game or something like that together and we're just chilling and hanging out, we're probably going to use but back and forth because it's kind of common for us, right? And it feels natural. Whereas and isn't going to feel as natural for you at the start, for sure. So when you do that, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's not going to destroy our relationship. We're still going to enjoy watching the soccer game, right? The problem with it is that how do we turn that off afterward when we're in the workplace or in more contentious conversations? So ideally, yes, ideally, but would be reserved for debate format conversations. And debate has a place in our world, and it always will. It ought not, though, to be the default that we use. And so, but it has its place in debate and not so much in other conversations. Great question.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Daniel, for the question. And we have Shrey with a question here for us. So Shrey, make sure you unmute your mic and ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you, Benny. It was very nice, and you can say it was very structured, basically, because I have learned a bit about conflict management, and we could see that organizations are also having a change model for that. So, what do you understand? Like, I just needed your feedback on the say that people look into confiding into small groups so that they can avoid conflict, and that is what is very important at times because we try to prioritize certain things. So, this is something which I have felt personally that what could be an easy resolution for that, and how to come out of it.
If I understand your question correctly, it's about how do we avoid avoiding conflict?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think the first thing about avoidance is to recognize that how destructive it is. In I think chapter 7, I think, of my book is entitled Avoidance and the Downward Spiral. And it shows how a conversation goes from ordinary problem solving to the polarization of a whole workplace. And as a mediator, I've seen that pattern, like from doing workplace restoration efforts where that kind of destruction has happened, polarization has happened. So that's the first part, is just becoming aware of the 7 stages of deterioration, that whole downward spiral, and its impacts. The second part is that when we use the collaborative message, the C message that I talk about in my book, then when we use it, the whole point of it is to engage the other person in the conversation that will find a solution that works for both of you so that you don't have to avoid having conversations. In using the C message, you create that atmosphere of safety. You approach the other person using neutral language so as to de-escalate the situation, create that environment of safety to begin with. You express your perspective and how you're being impacted. So what do you see happening and how you're experiencing it? You have the opportunity to say that why that's important to me is, so you get to describe what it is that's important to you and to offer a solution. So effectively, you're following steps 1 through 5 of the collaborative model, and you're able to do it in a 5-minute conversation. The more people become accustomed to using that, and when they become aware of the damage that avoidance causes, and then the effectiveness of the C message, then they will become less and less inclined to avoid. There's no easy way. It's a choice, isn't it? I mean, we can choose to engage the other person. We can choose to attack the other person, or we can choose to avoid the other person. We have 3 choices all of the time. Which one do we want to choose depends upon where we want to get to at the end of the day. Can I throw in one thing? Dr. Gottman talks about this. He talks about we have 3 choices anytime someone approaches. We can turn toward, we can turn away, or we can turn against, right? So, good morning. Good morning. How are you doing? That's a turn toward. Good morning. I don't know what you think is such a good morning. I had an awful morning. That's a turn against. Turn away is good morning. Good morning, Patrick. Where's that paper that where's that paper that we talked about yesterday? So you kind of almost ignore me, but barely acknowledge me and then move into a task-related thing. So that's a turning away. Here's the significance. Even in a strong relationship, when the response is not to turn toward, there's an 80% chance that the other person will not engage you again in a reasonable period of time. An 80% chance. So that gives you an indication of the importance of not avoiding and not attacking. And that leaves door number 3, which is to engage the other person. Does that help, Trey?
Yes. So just to follow up, very small follow-up. For example, if we are heading into a discussion or sort of a thing where a lot of brainstorming is happening and people try to figure out something which is not solving. So there are always solving differences. So there, how to reduce the conflict there, because that is a stage where people try to back out in a phase.
Yeah, exactly. In step 5, and I talk about this in my book, didn't get a chance to I didn't take the chance to, I had the chance to. I didn't take the chance to talk about it in my presentation. The key to step 5 is to avoid early evaluation, because early evaluation kills creativity. So what we do in my model is we have an explicit parameter around step 5 that says we will not explain, justify, or ask questions about any option that's raised. I mean, haven't we all been in meetings where someone said something as an idea and you thought to yourself, oh, that's a dumb idea. And then a bit later in the conversation, somebody comes back and they build on what was initially not such a hot idea, and it becomes a springboard for a better idea. The other part of that is that in order to even think that an idea isn't a good idea means your brain is working towards something else. And the last part of that is we fear being judged. I was in a diversity presentation and someone said to me, or said to the group, in the diversity conversation, right, we talk about gender and generation and color and creed and culture and all of that. You know what we don't talk about? The orphan. The orphan in the diversity conversation is diversity of thought. And that's the one that's important for human advancement. And so by banning, and it is pretty much a ban on any evaluation of ideas during brainstorming, we reduce that conflict that you're talking about.
Yes, sir, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrey. We are gonna have time only for 2 more questions, but I've posted Patrick's LinkedIn profile link there on the chat. I also posted the link to his YouTube channel. Make sure you sign up so you can see and you can watch his videos. We are going to be listening to a question by, I don't know, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Raghav. And then we have a question by G Power, right? So Raghav, is that it?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. Raghav, please.
Firstly, thank you, Patrick. It was a very insightful session, but especially for someone like me who, continuously works in various cross-functional teams and works on brainstorming sessions. One small query, and often I have faced this, is that you may try to work into a collaborative mode with another person or a group of team, but the person sitting across the desk from you, he or she may not have the similar opinion. They would come with a strongly opinionated thought process and they would just like to enforce or make sure that their opinion is heard and it is the say that matters. So how would you suggest that? How do we go about that?
The set parameters, Raghav, is a good starting point for that. When the group has that conversation at the outset, how are we going to talk about what we're going to talk about in order to have an effective meeting about it? That enables people to talk about things like, we need to listen with respect. We want to avoid personal attacks and that kinds of things. And there's a check-in at the end of that that says, okay, so can everyone live with those parameters? And if that other individual who's pretty hot about his idea says yes, then I mean, it kind of de-escalates the situation. That's a good starting point. I strongly encourage the use of the word perspective. So if I was chairing that meeting, I might say, let's go around, and what I want to hear is, what's your perspective on the situation? And what's your experience? What's your idea? And in doing that, the word perspective enables us all to step away from the idea that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And it puts everybody's perspective is on an even playing field, whereas truth, if something is true, then everything else is false. So that gets us away from, perspective helps move us away from either or type of approaches. The third piece, there is a tool that I'm incorporating into the Collaborators Toolbox, the book that I'm working on now, a series of easy to learn, easy to use tools. And one of those is the interview matrix. If you contact me on LinkedIn, I'll send you a brief summary of it. And it's a way of engaging people while everybody's wisdom in the room, while taking away their soapbox to pontificate from. So that's a tool that you could use if you had a group, say, 15, 16 to 50 maybe.
That's great. Thank you for the answer, and thank you for the question. And we have a question here by D Powers, where she says, brilliant discussion. And by the way, lots of people are complimenting the talk. I was very happy to see here that one of the participants said he felt he has gained learning the equivalent of an MBA after attending the session. I was very happy about that. So we have a question by D Powers, who says, brilliant discussion. When it comes to blab, what is a polite way to redirect the gossip? And if you explicitly express displeasure with gossip, the blabber may take offense and choose you as the next target.
Yeah. You know what? We used to teach that at one point. We used to say that the best approach was to go, you know what? I'm not really comfortable having this conversation. And then we realized that's a great question, Dee. There is no easy, polite way to do it. No, let me backtrack on that. There is an easy, polite way to do it. Last week, Dr. Paulette Dale talked about communicating assertively. So you can assert yourself and say, that's the kind of conversation that I don't participate in. Thank you for the invitation. I don't want to have that conversation. What we found in the field is that what happens is, so let's say Joel approaches me and wants to blab about Daniel. And I go, Joel, I'm not having that conversation. He'll go and he'll find Raghav or Shrey or someone else to have and to blab anyway. So the blab is going to happen with someone. If you acquire the skill of being an effective sounding board, a couple of things happen. One is using that skill insulates you from those two messages, the two destructive messages for which no words were used. And the second thing is it turns into a coaching conversation. And as an executive coach, you'll get this. It turns into a coaching conversation where you help that person to figure out what they want to do. The three traps of it, of course, is when you engage in it is we either they come to you because they think they're going to agree with you. We agree with them. So the first trap is agreeing with them. The second trap is what we call shoulding on them. We tell them what they should do or what we would have done in their shoes, and that doesn't work so well. And I forget what the third one is off the top of my head. In the end, though, so to summarize, that conversation is going to happen with someone. The health of the workplace is important to you. And if you want to keep the workplace healthy, you would acquire that sounding board skill, learn to use it, and to help them to find their solution, keeping in mind that no solution is a good solution until it is their solution. That's a great question. I love that one.
Yeah, great question and great answer. I'll be taking the last question by Anita. And just so that you know, at the very beginning of the workshop, I got some screenshots of all of you. And now at the end, I also got the screenshots so that we make sure we really deliver the certificates to all of you who have attended the session. And this will happen in kind of 2 weeks' time, right? Allow us with the time to produce this certificate. And you're going to be getting them via email. So Anita had a question which says, how to avoid confrontation with authoritarian bosses who don't listen to their employees?
Yeah, good grief. That's a tough one, Anita. Yeah, I'm scratching my head on that one too. I'll say this. Nothing works 100% of the time with everyone. Paulette Dale and I talk about this from time to time. There isn't a one-size-fits-all for collaboration or human interaction. There are times when debate is appropriate. There's times when avoidance is appropriate. There's times when rebuttal is appropriate as well. Dealing with that person whose mind is just so closed, that's a tough one, and I don't know that I or anyone else has a good answer for it. I think there's times when choosing to walk away, be assertive and walk away, is the most appropriate type of response. I'd like to know what Dr. Paulette Dale would have said on that. I really like that question. I've never found an answer to it, Anita.
Okay, that's great. Well, I can tell you that Anita always asks, tough questions. As you might know, she's my mom, and sometimes she asks me some tough questions. So before I thank you for being here today, Patrick, I'd like to announce everyone that next week we're going to be receiving 2 senior HR professionals, Gilma Correia and Marcia Goulart. They are both from Brazil, and they have worked for quite a while now in HR at very big institutions, at very big corporations, at multinational companies like Novartis, for example, that pharmaceutical company. And the topic next week will be rain dance in the corporate world, building your professional brand. So definitely building a professional brand is vital to the success in our professional lives. So once again, Patrick, I'd like to thank you very much for having taken my invitation. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to congratulate on the wonderful talk. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for being here. I put on the chat Patrick's LinkedIn profile. I'll do it once again. I'm also going to put, so this is Patrick's YouTube channel, as I had already posted. I'm also posting his LinkedIn profile, which is also here. And I'll be posting a direct link to Amazon.com where you can find his fantastic book. I bought it right away when I met Patrick, and I've been having a great time reading it. So I'd like to thank you all. It was a pleasure to have you here. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday. If you are in America, a wonderful rest of Sunday, a wonderful evening. If you are in India, or afternoon. If you are in Nigeria, as I know that our participant who is always here with us is here today again. Thank you all. Oh, Patrick has just put his WhatsApp number there. Feel free to reach out to him there as well. Hope to see you next week. Have a wonderful week, and let's get ready to sell our professional brand next week. Take care.
That should be a great conversation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Daniel. Bye-bye.
Wonderful week. Bye-bye.